Hello, everyone. Professor Dick is not his name. It's not his name? No. Professor Thick is... Nope. Professor Stick? Professor Stick is a secular atheist YouTube channel dedicated to debunking beliefs such as young earth creationism, flat earth, and other pseudoscientific claims. And while I appreciate such channels dedicated to exposing nonsense for what it is, Professor Stick has got to be the biggest disappointment. He has throughout the history of his channel made fallacious and outright false claims about science, religion, atheism, and morality, and where no other response seems to have prevailed, I will reveal Stick for committing the ultimate sin upon our kind, being an irrational atheist. Without further ado,
I thought I had it all together, but I was led astray the day you walked away.
Despite being a science channel, Professor Stick has made countless false claims about what science is, whether or not it's the only way to discover truth about our universe, and if it's compatible with religion. Unfortunately for the professor, I too have the power of nitpicking. I'll be starting with factual mistruths first, and then get into some more fundamental problems.
How does someone know the decay rate has remained constant since the rock formed?
Now, that's just really fucked up. Of course it's reasonable to assume that the physical constants of the universe have remained constant. It's stupid to think otherwise.
The half-life isn't technically a physical constant. It's defined in terms of probability. It's the time required for exactly half of the entities to decay on average. In other words, the probability of a radioactive atom decaying within its half-life is 50%. Also, some physicists such as Paul Dirac have speculated that physical constants have changed proportional to the age of the universe. Not saying he's correct, just that these constants that are constants right now could have been different constants at some other point in time. So I wouldn't say it's stupid to think otherwise, considering some physicists have looked into this. Speaking of radiometric dating...
Because in order to get accurate rock dates, one would have to accurately know both the decay rate and the initial conditions of the rock sample, right?
And we do know both of these things. We do know the initial conditions. If you take a look at any decay equations, they all have a variable that requires us to know the initial conditions. So yes, we know them for God's sake.
The variable in the equation n sub 0 isn't what he's referring to by initial conditions. He means environmental conditions. N sub 0 is just the initial population of parent atoms. The actual equations don't require knowledge of the initial conditions to be calculated. These environmental conditions are probably taken into account to calculate potential contamination.
We don't really accept something as true until it becomes a theory or a law.
Ah yes, look at all these factual, superseded theories. It's not as if the point of science is to admit when we're wrong and update our knowledge when new data is collected and a better explanation is presented. Once we make a theory, it's just fact.
In science, we rigorously test our hypotheses until they become theories.
No, it's not as if scientists test a bunch of hypotheses and once enough evidence is collected, it magically graduates into a theory. A scientific theory is an explanation of an aspect of the natural world that can be repeatedly tested and verified. It contains various hypotheses that support the overall theory. It's broader than a hypothesis. For example, a hypothesis would be fur coloration well matched to their habitat is an adaptation that protects mice from predators. But a theory would be evolutionary adaptations arise from natural selection. Notice how the hypothesis supports the theory. This experiment was actually done by Hopi Hoekstra and her colleagues in 2010 to support Darwin's theory. Technically, theories don't even need to have any evidence at all. Lamarck's theory of inheritance of acquired characteristics was a theory stating that adaptations, which he believed to be changes during an organism's life, would be passed down to the next generation. For example, if I were a giraffe and would use my neck to reach for leaves in higher places, my neck would get longer due to me using it more, and subsequently my offspring would have a longer neck. It had no evidence to support it, was disproven by Weismann's experiment, and superseded by Darwin's theory of natural selection. But it was still a testable, verifiable, broad explanation of some aspect of the natural world, and thus a theory. So, case in point, just because something is a theory does not make a fact. Theories can have various levels of evidence that either make them strong or weak. Moving on.
Second of all, many physicists believe in the Big Crunch hypothesis, that eventually gravity overcomes dark energy and pulls everything together into a singularity, after which the temperature gets so hot it expands again in another Big Bang. Their hypothesis suggests that the universe never had a beginning after all, and just goes through cycles of crunches and bangs.
False. This hypothesis fell out in the 90s when we learned that the rate of expansion of the universe was accelerating, so I wouldn't say many physicists believe in it today.
See, in science, there's this thing called the burden of proof. If you make a positive claim, you have to back it up with evidence. It's not our job to disprove you.
No. The burden of proof lies with whoever makes any claim. If I claim that God certainly does not exist, I need to back this up with some positive evidence. Now, this is different from saying that due to a lack of evidence, I don't hold the belief that God exists. The former posits that there is some logical contradiction in believing in God, whereas the latter is the withholding of belief until more evidence is presented.
For them, there are only material objects in this world, and everything can be explained in a materialistic way.
Nope, that's wrong. You see, that would be making a claim now, wouldn't it? There are certain people who do believe that everything is entirely materialistic. I won't deny that. But that's a tiny fraction of people. The vast majority of atheists don't make a claim. They dismiss the claim of a god. They also dismiss the claim that everything is materialistic. You see, all we are doing is not believing in any hypothesis that isn't supported by evidence. There is no evidence of materialism. Therefore, we reject that claim too.
Does that mean you believe in a soul then? Alright, nitpicks aside, let's dig a little deeper. What is science? You say that science is a method that...
Certainly, you can agree that the scientific method, which utilizes a very specific step-by-step process involving hypothesizing, testing, publishing, peer-reviewing, and retesting, is different than the way religion makes its claims.
There is no one method that scientists must rigidly follow. You're right in that science is a process of inquiry that includes making observations, forming logical, testable hypotheses, and then testing them repeatedly. But there won't always be an independent and dependent variable. It's far less structured than you make it out to be. I'm going to give Stick the benefit of the doubt here since he may not have been claiming that science is a one-size-fits-all method, but it's important to clear the air about this common misconception. For example, in an observational study, the researcher compares subjects against a control group and comes to the conclusion. An example would be if we have a research study comparing the risks of developing liver cancer between people who drink daily and teetotalers? People who don't drink alcohol. There is no independent variable and we have no control over the experiment, as in we can't manipulate the variables because we're not trying to establish a cause and effect relationship, rather a correlational one. We're still testing hypotheses without actually doing an experiment where we manipulate variables. You claim science is the only reliable means for discovering truth.
I think one of the things I began to realize was that by its very nature, science was unable to answer a whole range of questions about meaning and purpose and identity.
I'm sorry that you're disappointed by that, but science cannot answer those things for us. Science only deals with things we can prove. It involves gathering evidence to discover the reality of the universe. Things like meaning and purpose are not things that you can empirically prove or test, because by definition, those things are subjective, and science doesn't give a fuck about your feelings.
And it seemed to me that either I had to say this is just nonsense, or there is something there which science can't get access to, and I need to discover this.
Objectively speaking, how would you even know that there's something beyond science? Science is a method, so you're essentially saying that there's potentially something that we can't discover with the scientific method. In that case, there's no reason to ever believe that something like that even exists. Science is the best method we have to discovering truth to the universe. Anything other than that cannot give reliable results, so if you're looking for something that science cannot give, then essentially you can't prove it's ever there to begin with.
Let's start with the fact that you admit that there are questions science cannot answer. There's even more questions than he mentions here. Questions about personal identity, which is what makes us who we are, purpose, meaning, what knowledge is, what it means for something to be right and wrong, and if they're objective, another thing I'll get into in my next section, have to be questions that science can answer. If you're a physicalist, which is just the position that only the natural world exists, then science by definition has to answer these questions. Who we are, why we want to purpose, and how we have meaning, as well as other subjective internal experience, all arise from physical reactions. Thus, they not only can, but must be objectively measurable and provable. If they're not, then your claim that science is the ultimate means for discovering truth about our universe is moot, since something in our universe is unexplainable. Well, now let me be clear. I am an atheist, and I do believe there is a physical explanation for these phenomena. All I'm doing is pointing out Stick's own claim to be false. But even if science couldn't answer these questions, there is a means that can. Can you guess what it is? It's philosophy. Using this inferior but still useful tool, we can answer all these questions. Want to know what makes you you? Read Perry's dialogue on personal identity and immortality. Want to know what it means to know? Read any article on epistemology. Want to know how to do good science? Read up on the philosophy of science. Science is the best tool, but philosophy certainly comes in a close second, and I don't appreciate such an arrogant and frankly stupid handwave to one of the earliest means of discovering truth that has been built upon for thousands of years. You've said in the past also that religion is not compatible with science. You say this because
people need to consider less the specific claims that religion and science makes and instead look more deeply into the methods that we use to obtain information. Certainly, you can agree that the scientific method, which utilizes a very specific step-by-step process involving hypothesizing, testing, publishing, peer reviewing, and retesting, is different than the way religion makes its claims. Following an ancient book written by ancient people and trusting eye testimonies is certainly something science will never do.
you're making a blanket claim here. I know you mean Christianity, but come on, there's thousands of other religions out there that don't just blindly accept a book. Buddhism and many Hindu sects follow practice rather than pure dogma and don't even regard texts as having truth beyond the goal of both, which is samsara, the liberation from the cycle of death and rebirth. Furthermore, it isn't even the case that all Christians just accept the Bible without question. I'm going to tear into this in a moment, but there's hundreds of philosophical arguments out there for God's existence. You can still be religious and gather information by the process of testing the God hypothesis and other claims made in the Bible using reason rather than blind faith.
I thought I had it all together, but I was led astray the day you walked away.
This is the section that pisses me the most off about Stick. I am an atheist, as I've said before. I believe atheism is rational. People like Stick make me ashamed to be an atheist. Let me explain. I don't know how many times you've made creationist blanket claims.
I'm sorry that science wasn't enough for you, but to wander off and make shit up without any evidence or objectivity is not a good excuse to turn to theism. And that's the other thing about you creationist people. You guys are denying science and claiming that you know the truth.
Blind faith does not mean you're religious, but if you're religious, that means you have blind faith.
I argued that design had to extend down to the level of biological class. And class is something like fish versus birds versus mammals and so on.
Interesting. That's actually fairly different than what most creationists believe, it seems. And from what I've observed, intelligent design proponents often use the word kinds in an extremely vague fashion that has no value in scientific discussion.
Only about 38% of Christians in the US believe in a literal historical account, and even less so throughout the world. This is mostly due to the fundamentalist movement and it being focused in America rather than the rest of the world. Creationism is not a science, it's a philosophy that posits that the universe was created by an intelligent designer. Only a select few creationists believe in a young Earth. Nothing new is actually being said with your 50 creationist videos when you criticize such a small and dwindling minority. Not to mention you misunderstand various arguments proposed by creationists.
Okay, I'm pretty tired of people trying to say that atheism is evil because Stalin was an atheist. While we're on this topic, I'm going to explain my point of view in it. People do bad things because they're bad. Stalin did bad things not because he was an atheist. You can't do something in the name of not being something.
The argument is that because Stalin was an atheist, he believes in no afterlife and no consequences. One who is an atheist who believes in some sort of negative afterlife is less likely to commit genocide than one who doesn't.
There is, however, other scientists who believe that evolution is actually more of a process of development. There is someone who is developing species into other species. They believe that evolution is actually the way the Creator has chosen to deal with his creation.
This has been something I thought about a lot. I've interacted with a lot of different religious people, and probably the most popular way they try to integrate their beliefs into evolution is by claiming that God guided the process of evolution, which eventually turned all the living organisms into what they are today. While yes, this is better than being a young Earth creationist, I still have a few problems with this belief system. Now, I won't go into the stories within the Bible or Quran directly, so instead we'll just talk about the idea of God directing evolution. The question here is why? There's no reason to inject the idea of a guide in there when there simply doesn't need to be one. The only reason would be to desperately attempt to have your religion somehow fit within reality. But what scientific reason is there exactly to do so? Evolution can be entirely explained with natural drivers. We've mapped out all the mechanisms and we've done countless simulations. Does God interfere with computer simulations too? The great thing about science is that it weeds out a lot of the unnecessary fluff. If a claim cannot be proven, it is not accepted to be true. That doesn't apply to just claims by itself, but also additional details within claims. God guiding evolution is not something that has been supported by any sort of evidence in any shape or form, so it is unreasonable to believe in such a silly hypothesis.
God, since he is God, selected from a number of possible worlds and chose our world in which evolution results in man. He doesn't need to directly interfere with evolution as it's happening to make it happen, because, at least under classical theism, he set up the initial conditions to bring it about. You would know this if you read the watchmaker argument or even knew what classical theism was.
Immediately we have a huge problem. See, you're portraying atheism as if atheists claim that there is no God, and that the answer to, is there a God, is no. However, although that would define an atheist, that's not what we would answer, at least most of us at least. The definition of atheist is just a theist, someone who isn't a theist. So as long as someone doesn't answer yes to the question, is there a God, it means they're an atheist. If you answered maybe, then ta-da, you're an atheist, because you're not a theist. It's as simple as that. If you're not a theist, you're an atheist. All atheists are doing is rejecting that claim due to a lack of evidence. We're not making our own claim. We're not claiming that God does not exist. All we're doing is observing your claim and say, no, not convinced.
I hope here to clearly define atheism and debunk the completely incoherent concept, agnostic atheism. According to the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, atheism is typically defined in terms of theism. Theism, in turn, is best understood as a proposition, something that is either true or false. It is often defined as the belief that God exists, but here belief means something believed. It refers to the propositional content of belief. To clarify, the distinction between propositional attitude and psychological condition of believing is the way you argue it. Theists argue the proposition God exists, whereas if one argued for the psychological condition, they'd be arguing that they hold the belief God exists, which is not even something to be argued. This is why it makes sense to say that theism is true or false and to argue for or against theism. If, however, atheism is defined in terms of theism, and theism is the proposition that God exists and not the psychological condition of believing that there is a God, then it follows that atheism is not the absence of the psychological condition of believing that God exists. The A in atheism must be understood as a negation instead of an absence, as not instead of without. Therefore, in philosophy at least, atheism should be construed as the proposition that God does not exist, or more broadly, the proposition that there are no gods. In the context of philosophy, it's not a lack of belief, as many current atheists like to define it as. Of course, definitions are fluid, and many atheists prefer this definition because it escapes the burden of proof. But here's the thing, my little chili babies. We already have a word that accurately describes a lack of belief: agnosticism. Roughly, Huxley's principle says that it is wrong to say that one knows or believes that a proposition is true without logically satisfactory evidence. But it was Huxley's application of this principle to theistic and atheistic belief that ultimately had the greatest influence upon the meaning of the term. He argued that, since neither of those beliefs is adequately supported by evidence, we ought to suspend judgment on the issue of whether or not there is a God.
We can't make a claim either way on whether or not a supernatural being exists. The main part of your friend's argument isn't on the fact that we can't see or touch God, it's on the fact that we can't experiment on the idea of it. So tell me, how do you reach a conclusion on something that you can't test? You simply can't reach a conclusion. So on the subject on whether or not a God exists, since you can't test it, you can't make a conclusion either way. This is the atheist position.
No stick. Under the definition of how both have always been used by academics and scholars, you're an agnostic. So if you are an atheist, the burden of proof is on you to prove that God does not exist, just as much as it is on theists to prove that he does.
Plus, you can't even prove that God does not exist. How do you prove that some supernatural being does not exist?
Moving on. Wait. I think I'm forgetting something. Something important. Ah, yes.
Can you be good without God?
Since your God doesn't exist, I'm gonna say that you can be good without God. We're not claiming that God does not exist. Since your God doesn't exist. We're not claiming that God does not exist.
Ladies and gentlemen, we got him.
But what I hate most about Professor Stick is this right here.
Tell me, how do you reach a conclusion on something that you can't test? You simply can't reach a conclusion. I'm sorry that science wasn't enough for you, but to wander off and make shit up without any evidence or objectivity is not a good excuse to turn to theism.
No proof. Really, Stick. There's absolutely zero evidence for God. There's absolutely no way to test whether or not God exists. Thousands of years of inquiry and debate into whether or not he exists, and just zilch. All those philosophical schools dedicated to this subject just don't exist. All those philosophers who came up with arguments, never real. No, but I get it. You must have a really strong rebuttal to Leibniz's cosmological argument. I probably just wasn't there when you posted your video debunking the transcendental argument.
The honest position is to simply say we don't know for sure since we cannot do an experiment.
Oh, now I think I see the issue. If you can't put an immaterial, outside of space and time, omnipresent by definition, not physical God into a lab, there's absolutely no way to know whether or not it's real. This right here, folks, is the epitome of reason.
I thought I had it all together, but I was led astray the day you walked away.
Lastly, I'm going to be directly responding to Professor Stick's response to the Dennis Prager Moral Facts video.
Do you believe that good and evil exist?
Good and evil aren't absolute terms. They don't mean anything unless you compare them to something else. Just saying good and evil means nothing. They are relative terms and don't represent anything objective.
Depends on what the meaning of these terms are. You never actually provide a definition of good and evil, but many other philosophers, who are a lot smarter than you, have. Under the meaning of virtue ethics, anything good is whatever fulfills its function, and anything bad is whatever doesn't. For example, a water bottle that can hold water is a good one, and one that can't is a bad one. So in this case, we wouldn't need to compare it to anything else, because this is not relative. Things either are good at fulfilling their function or they're not.
In addition, acts that are seen to be good in some cultures may not be in others. We can all acknowledge that good and evil exist. The only difference is that we wouldn't acknowledge that objective good and evil exist.
Moral error theorists don't believe morality exists. And simply because cultures disagree on what is right and wrong doesn't inherently make them not objective. Simply because people disagree on something doesn't mean that what they disagree on is subjective. Arguments like the partners in crime argument attempt to prove objective morality, once again showing your ignorance.
Well, yes, we would say it's wrong, normally, but let me pose another scenario. If you were the only one that had the knowledge that someone was going to commit mass genocide tomorrow and the only way to stop him was to murder him, would that be wrong to do so? If you could travel back in time to murder Hitler, would that be wrong?
Depends. If you're a deontologist/Kantian, the answer would be yes. It would be wrong to murder under any circumstances, including someone who is about to commit mass genocide or baby Hitler. But if you're a utilitarian, it would be the right thing to do since the amount of lives being saved is more. Congratulations, you can come up with a moral dilemma.
Moral relativism, meaning that morality is not absolute, but only relative to the individual or to the society.
Right, and what's the problem with that?
If it is subjective, then you can't argue that gay people should have rights, you can't argue that we have a moral obligation to give women the right to abort, and you can't argue that we shouldn't rape, because all these things that society says are wrong are all subjective. You've even said that abortion for women has more pros and cons, but in order to argue this, you need an objective basis for morality, otherwise such claims are baseless. What reason does one have to not rape any more than to rape? Because society says so? What does that change? Let's say there were a society who was in favor of raping. Why should I value that particular society's values over another? Because it helps me survive better? What reason should I value survival any more than not survival? This is the problem with holding a moral subjectivist view but making objective moral claims. I have no reason to value your values or someone else's values over each other, and they're all equal.
I'm sure you think murder is wrong, but how do you know?
Again, I don't know. Nobody knows.
I'm getting tired of repeating the same points over and over again. There's a whole field of study involving these questions, so it's useless to try and even sum it up here.
I thought I had it all together, but I was led astray the day you walked away.
I doubt he'll actually respond to this, not just because I'm a small YouTuber, but because he never likes to respond to decent videos made on him. In 2017, Meridian Struggle responded to his video, Science Turns You Away from Atheism. In this video, he made a lot of points that I'm making, his ignorance and arrogance about philosophy and arguments for God. Instead, he opted to respond to this video.
I can see what you're saying. Oh, look, science can't tell us things that by their own very definition can't be objectively proven, so I'm going to turn to theism.
Notice how this shallow prick is insulting his accent when he says turn to theism.
Are you kidding me? You think that was an attempt to insult his accent? That sounds nothing like his accent.
He said in the past that he likes to go for low-hanging fruit. This video is not low-hanging fruit. It would take more effort than he's probably ever had to put into a video to respond to this. But as long as his video goes unresponded, my points still stand, so I'm not at all concerned. Until next time.
What a mess. Pride cometh before the fall. I guess he got what he deserved. What is that? Hand me the laser defibrillator. Hey guys, can I help? No! Go clean the toilets. Maybe you'll make friends with some turds. You make us ashamed to be ourselves.